Our next witness wishes to be known as Stu, does he?
That's correct.
Stu, please.
Please state your full name.
Stuart James Gregg.
Repeat after me. I do solemnly,
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly declare and affirm
sincerely and truly declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Stu, there were two things that you wanted us to address at the very start of your evidence. The first one was that you're a bit nervous of giving evidence because you have quite severe brain fog.
I do, yes.
And you're concerned about how that will affect your concentration.
Yeah, I'm prone to lapses of concentration and forgetting where I am sometimes.
But we said we're just going to go nice and slowly,
Yep.
and we'll keep on track as
Yeah,
best
you
we
can
can.
bear with me if that happens.
And secondly, you've never told your partner's family about your infections.
That's right, yeah.
And many of your friends also don't know about your infections.
Yeah, the majority of my friends and family aren't aware.
It's only really your nuclear family.
Yeah, so my my mother, my sister, stepfather, stepmother, and my father's died. So
And beyond that circle,
nobody knows.
nobody knows.
That's right.
So giving evidence today is really significant for you.
Absolutely, it's important for us as a family as well as obviously for our community.
Starting at the beginning, you have severe Hemophilia A,
That's right.
and there's no history of it in your family. It was simply a genetic mutation.
Yeah, it's a genetic mutation, yeah.
You were diagnosed at 18 months old, and received regular treatment at the Birmingham Children's Hospital.
That's it, slightly before 18 months, but roughly. And I was treated at Birmingham Children's.
Under Dr. Hill. And you have some specific concerns about Dr. Hill's general approach to treatment.
Obviously not when I was very young, because you're not familiar with how things can be done differently. But in hindsight, a lot of the treatment involved heavy factor VIII treatment and lots of bed rest. So just something simple like a muscle bleed into my thigh could end up with 2 to 3 weeks bed rest in hospital, which looking back is ridiculous. So, and then all you're doing is weakening other muscles, weakening joints. So as soon as you get up again, you get bleeds in other parts of the body. So.
You've also raised concerns in your statement about the extent of factor VIII product use. Again, in hindsight, was going on.
That's right. I was treated quite heavily. I wasn't a 0% haemophiliac factor VIII levels. My levels tended to be between about 2 and 4%. I'm not entirely sure what they are to this day, but I seem to bleed a lot more than my factor VIII levels would normally, as a haemophiliac would normally bleed with those sort of levels. But I was treated very heavily since I became an adult and had more independence in my treatment. I'm able to minimise treatment completely compared to years ago.
You were treated with cryoprecipitate until about November 1980.
That's right.
And then you were given factor VIII.
Yes.
And your usual treatment was with Armour products.
That was the dominant treatment we had roughly until the mid-80s.
What was your mother told about the factor VIII?
So, when I was first diagnosed, my mother, because there was no history of haemophilia in our family, my mother spoke to Dr. Hill. she was told that there was a treatment now available which involved a blood product. Ironically, looking back, she thought that was a real positive because it would be a safer product than some kind of chemical synthetic product. Can you repeat the question again, please?
What was your mum told about the factor VIII and its safety?
Yeah. As regarding its viral safety, that was never raised with her. She was told to keep on treating, basically. She did attend a conference, a haemophilia conference in Bournemouth in the very early 80s, where there was a representative from ARMA present at the conference. It was David Waters would have been the chairman of the Hemophilia Society at that time. And she spoke to the ARMA rep herself, and he spoke to people as a whole at the conference. And she was told things such as the blood products were safe and that they knew where all the products were sourced from, where all the blood was sourced from.
You've described in your statement that she was assured they were completely safe and that the products came from researched people.
Yeah, there was like a registry of where the products, of where the blood was coming from, yes.
You were in hospital in November 1981 and contracted TB whilst in. You think that's probably when you seroconverted?
Well, it's hard to say for definite when I seroconverted, and that might be, now looking at other parts of my medical records, a little bit too early for the seroconversion. But I did, so with the TB, first of all, I was in hospital for a normal bleed. We were on oncology ward. There was another patient there with a cancer-related health problem. That patient's family came to visit, and someone had TB and infected some of the haemophiliacs who were on that ward. So there was always a question why haemophiliacs who had higher, better immune systems, theoretically, became disposed to TB, whereas other people on the ward didn't, who may have been more immunocompromised than the haemophiliacs. Do you want me to go on to talk about the TB treatment now?
Of course, yes.
Yeah. Remind me in a minute to go back to the seroconversion bit. So the TB treatment, so I wasn't aware, when I was infected with TB, I wasn't aware, obviously. At a later date, I was admitted to hospital with another bleed, which was just a sort of routine admission. I was left in the hospital overnight. My mother came to visit me the next day, and I'd been moved to a different ward, which was Ward 5. Anyone who went to Birmingham Children's Hospital in that period knew Ward 5 wasn't a very cosy ward to be on. I was quite poorly. My arm had all swollen up, and there was no medical staff available. Eventually, my mother managed to speak to the nurse on the ward, and it turned out that I'd been tested for TB. I'd had a reaction to the test, and that's why I was poorly. Apparently, I was in hospital for the best part of a week, and with a spiking temperature. Eventually, I was let home, and then over the course, just after that, all my family was sent for chest x-rays to see if there was TB present. Following that, I was given an 18-month course of anti-TB treatment or similar. I think the names of the drugs will be in my notes.
And you wanted to come back to the question of seroconversion because in your statement you talked about 1981 and that instance
Yeah.
of TB being when you seroconverted.
That's right. So, but looking at my records since then, it just seemed peculiar why we were infected with TB when others weren't. And it seemed coincidental. If my immune system was lowered, that could have been during the seroconversion. But there was another occasion in about 83 when I was rushed. I seemed to be suffering from an asthma attack, but I didn't have asthma at the time, and I couldn't breathe. I was taken to the local hospital. They gave me a nebulizer. That didn't work, and so I was rushed in an ambulance to Birmingham Hospital. I can remember the journey now, and I eventually either fell asleep or just drifted off as on the journey, and I was just very poorly, and I was admitted to hospital again, and that seems to tie in more likely with the period of seroconversion.
In 1984, your mum attended a meeting called by Dr. Hill, and you've talked about it with your mum, about the availability of factor products. What's your mum said about that meeting?
Okay, so there was a couple of separate issues there with meeting Dr. Hill. So there was a meeting with parents Dr. Hill had, and it was I might need to just read the actual notes she told me. So Dr. Hill had said that he could no longer provide an adequate service and was asking parents if they could approach their MPs to see if they could lobby government to get more funding and support. That was for the overall service. So my mum would have written to our local MP, which was Michael Spicer at the time, and requested that. She's got those letters still.
At that meeting, was there anything said, as far as your mum recalls, about the risk of infection from
No.
products?
There was never that. It wasn't about infection in treatment or anything like that. Separately to that, at a later date, it was always a battle to get home treatment. And when we did have home treatment, there was 2 occasions where mother was phoned up by the hospital completely out of the blue and asked to immediately return all products that we had. And she recalls one time it was close to tea time and she received a call and we were told to go straight up with the products. No reason given. And she says because there was no real correlation between what was happening and the products. It just never all fitted. At the time, it just seemed a request. There wasn't sort of any sort of ulterior motive for it, perhaps. But and again, in hindsight, it seems quite peculiar.
And please, can we have document 1252011, Henry? We have here a series of results, and we can see, or if you go down to the other half of the page, we can see on the right-hand side that you were found to be hepatitis B surface antigen positive in 1985, 28th of January 1985. And then on the left-hand side, it's not very clear on this copy, but putting it together with other documents as well in your medical records, on the left-hand side, HTLV3 antibody status, 1984, result positive. And other HCDO records you have suggest that the first positive result related to a sample from the 16th of March 1984.
That seems to be the case, yeah. And it was presumably from retrospective stored blood samples.
And if we go down to the bottom of the page, there is a tick box, which on this copy, unfortunately, we can't see it quite so clearly as the original, but it says parents aware, tick. But we don't know when that was ticked. How was your mum told that you were HTLV-3 positive?
Well, she wasn't, and it sounds quite strange, but it was her awareness of my HIV was in a very piecemeal fashion. It was, she describes it as being almost drip fed. She said that at the time when it first started being in the newspapers and the media, there was an underlying concern that all haemophiliacs were HIV positive, and that and the mothers were just hoping that that might not be the case. Over time, things happened. Things were mentioned. Some boys got ill, and it just became apparent that I was HIV positive. But my mother was never sat down and informed that this was the situation and this was the case.
And looking through your medical records, there's no notes that suggest that there was a consultation at which
absolutely.
HTLV-3 was discussed. There's simply nothing there.
No, and she's adamant that it just simply didn't happen. There was no conversation, and it just became apparent over time.
And on one occasion, the ward's sister simply said, "Isn't it sad about the boys?"
Yeah, and it would have been presumably quite difficult for some of the medical staff as well, but it was little comments like that which sort of built a picture up rather than actually being sat down and told this is what's happened.
Were you ever directly told that you were HTLV-3
No, there was.
or HIV positive?
Again, it's hard. I definitely wasn't sat in a room and said this is the situation, but it's hard to sort of formulate an idea of when it became apparent to me. The best way I can think about it is I can clearly remember watching the television and seeing some of the adverts on telly, which would have been, I think, around about late 86, 87, and knowing that that's referred to me and my situation. So I think I had an understanding around about that time. But no, I was never aware. Well, never told that this has happened. The other thing, and that awareness would have continued because I remember Dr. Hill talking to me about once I became a teenager, in my early teenage years, that if I was going to have a partner, to be aware of safe sex, and that was reiterated at clinic appointments.
Using a condom and cleaning up any blood spillages was something that you were very aware of.
Absolutely, yeah. So for my mother, she tried to like a lot of families, not make people not. She tried to hide the HIV from the community, schools, and so what she tended to do was use hepatitis, because it was a notifiable disease. She'd say to the school that I had hepatitis, and that if there was any accidents or spillages, that I would deal with it myself. And all I was told, I remember being told repeatedly as a child, if you cut yourself, just deal with it yourself. And I just did, because I was quite capable of doing so. But this was really important for my mother, and that's how she sort of shielded me. the family had moved to a more rural location, and she wanted to try to bring me up as normal as could be possible in that kind of situation, and me to have a normal existence rather than being institutionalised like some of the haemophiliacs ended up, I suppose.
You've described in your statement that responsibility of cleaning up any spillages and latterly in terms of sexual relationships weighed very heavily on your shoulders and had an impact going forwards into adulthood.
Absolutely, yeah. Because there's a burden of responsibility rather than a burden of not wanting to infect anyone else, and that was your responsibility. You had to make sure that happened, and so as I was a growing teenager, that was really important. So I went to a normal mainstream high school. Other people would be forming relationships, and whilst I did, there was always something in the back of my mind that there was a problem that I was very aware of.
Over time, there were also discussions at your clinic appointments about your CD4 levels.
That's right.
And you became very aware that as they reduced, then you were in trouble. And you said you had an understanding that you had very little time to live.
That's right, yeah. So CD4s were the only real barometer of health, or probably disease progression's a better word. So I always knew that, well, the expectation was that I would die from my HIV diagnosis. So you just try to sort of get on with things. And having the CD4s gave you a bit of a barometer of how things were going. But obviously, when they start to plummet, it's sort of a bit unnerving, perhaps. I was very fortunate. I was generally asymptomatic, so I never had any serious infections. But my CD4s, I know by about 90. So by about 93, there would have been, I think they were around about 150, and they went down to 10, and they remained at 10 for a considerable time. And they were at 10 when I started my HIV medication in 97.
Which we'll come to in just a minute.
Yep.
But before we get there, you've said you were constantly surprised to reach particular milestones in your life, 16,
yeah.
18, 21. Can you tell us a little bit of what the impact of that was on you emotionally at that age?
Again, it's hard. Because you're a child, there's no context to sort of mark things against, but all I knew was, I remember thinking when I was about 13 that I probably wouldn't live to be 16. And then when I was 16, I was reasonably surprised, and I thought I probably wouldn't reach 18. And then, of course, 18, and you don't think you're going to get past 21, but you keep on hitting these marks, and it was a positive surprise, I suppose. I'd sort of, not in a negative or sad way, but I'd sort of adjusted myself to that was what the reality was, and I wouldn't be reaching an old age, and I fully expected to die in my teenage years, yeah.
In relation to those teenage years, you've obtained your medical records, and there are no letters from the hospital to your GP that refer to you being HTLV3 positive until 1987. And the first letter that there is 1252012. If we could have that on the screen, please, Henry. And what we see here is it's dated the 10th of September 1987, and it deals with an admission you'd had because a cricket ball had struck you over your eyebrow. And then at the bottom, there is simply an NB. NB, this patient is positive for hepatitis B surface antigen and has normal liver function tests. He's positive to HIV antibody. Before 1987, there's no record at all there's nothing in your records to indicate any communication between the hospital and the GP of any results. But during that time, you were still having treatment, including dental extractions.
That's right, yeah.
And so others were treating you and were seemingly unaware of your status.
Yeah, they were, yeah, that would have been a problem. It was something I was unaware of because I didn't know what kind of communication was happening between my GP and the hospital. Again, I think I would have seen my GP, but generally speaking, I spend more time at the hospital, and my mother thinks I probably spent somewhere between about 30 to 40% of my time at the hospital.
You believe you were used for the purposes of research throughout your childhood and particularly through your teenage years. You know your parents were asked if you could participate in a study in 1990 into the psychological impact of haemophilia, but you also think you were used in other research programmes. Why is that?
It's hard to say. There's very little that I can sort of bring up and say why I think that, but there was an awful lot of blood being taken. When I was in hospital, lots of tests were done, and the only thing my mum can ever remember them saying they were testing for would be inhibitors against my factor VIII, which is something which is done reasonably regularly, I suppose, but wouldn't have constituted the amount of blood that was taken or the other testing that was done.
Your sense is that because so much blood was taken on such a regular basis, that they may have been testing for other things and using the blood for research.
It's an assumption, but I can't prove it, but it feels a bit excessive to take the amount that was taken for inhibitors tests. You've
described the sort of growing knowledge around your HIV status as you were a teenager, but then in 1998 you've said you became empowered and knowledgeable about it. What was it about 1998 that gave you that sense of that understanding?
Okay, so prior to 97, my sort of future and my health had been going in one sort of direction. Like I said earlier, which I was accepting of where that was going, and I was quite sure that that was the end result eventually, that my death would be the end result eventually. I wasn't empowered about HIV generally. I didn't try to avoid it, but I wasn't reading research papers, I wasn't learning about HIV at that age. And then in January 97, I started sort of pretty much out the blue, really. My consultant at the time, Dr. Wild, and this will now be at the adult hospital, he said that there were some new drugs to try, and it might be worth me trying them. Obviously, my health was in a precarious situation, even though I was asymptomatic.
Till that point, you'd been on some AZT, but not particularly complied.
So I'd been on AZT. So 97, I started my HIV, my heart regime, but so definitely in the 8 years prior, and perhaps even a bit longer, I had been prescribed AZT and DDI, dodanazine. I always got a feeling when they were prescribed to me that it just felt a bit wishy-washy. It wasn't really, there didn't seem to be any substance. I don't know why I read into it like that. I did take them for a bit. They made me feel really sick, and I just generally stopped taking them, which probably wasn't such a good idea, but in hindsight, it turned out to be quite good. When I started my new regime in January 97, it felt like a more positive step to take. It felt like this could actually have positive results, and I made a decision to give it a proper go and to be fully adherent.
That decision also coincided with starting a university course in health and social
so that's right.
Care.
So I started in 97. Up until that time, I'd done okay at school, but I probably could have done a lot better. I'd been sort of floating around. I hadn't been working, and it's hard, especially when your friends work and you just look like you're sort of scrounging off the state to other people. I decided it was time to do something more positive and constructive, and so I started at university in September 98, and I spent quite a long time at university following that. So by the time I started, about 18 months or so after my treatment, I was under the impression that my health was, even though my CD4 count was really low still, probably still about, it was 10 for years, so it was probably still about 10 then. But I felt like things were moving in the right direction, my viral load was undetectable, and I wanted to educate myself, and some of the courses I took meant that I could learn more about HIV. I became much more empowered. I did voluntary work at a local HIV centre, which tied in with my degree. And I started to understand how HIV manifests, how it works in your body, how treatments work, and I was just completely ignorant up until that point. It was like turning a switch on, and I started to understand it better, and that really empowered me to take control of my own health and be positive about my own health as well.
Because until you started studying it yourself, nobody had actually sat down and explained it to you in a way that you could understand and get to grips with.
It wasn't even explained in the way I could understand. It was just wasn't explained. It was just, you're HIV positive, and that's it. So these are your CD4s. These indicate how well you are, and that's sort of plummeting down, and that there's nothing to tie anything to. There was no structure about improving my knowledge and my understanding of HIV. But that's probably not a doctor's role. But you're just sort of like an ostrich. You got your head in the ground. You got no idea what's going on. But by empowering yourself and becoming more knowledgeable, you can really then take proactive steps in your own health. And I might talk about later, perhaps, about a lot of haemophiliacs, especially haemophiliacs with viral infections, end up becoming expert patients themselves. They go to see their GP, and the GP they know more than the GP about their situation, and that's positive, because that means they can make better decisions about their own treatment and care.
And for you, that resulted in you being on a better combination of drugs. The combination of drugs was working more, and you were starting to feel better. And since then, you've been more compliant. Yeah,
so I was always really compliant. There was very few drugs available in 97, and we were always told. So this was another thing about compliance as well, is there weren't all the families of drugs there are now. If you failed a drug or you stopped taking it and you became resistant to that drug, that was a serious problem, because you only had so many options. So I got really quite sick. I was hospitalised because of side effects from the drugs. you get the normal things like sickness and diarrhea and dizziness and all that kind of stuff, but I had something called hemophilia, which it affected my kidneys. I'd be passing blood instead of urine, and just those kind of things, really. But yeah, you do learn about your own care.
But throughout the 1990s and the 2000s until about 2010 or 2012, you weren't treated by a specialist HIV doctor. Your HIV care was simply within the Haemophilia Centre.
That's right, yeah.
And you have some views about that now.
So I do. I mean, in hindsight, it would have probably been from a medical efficacy kind of perspective, it would have been better to have sort of an expert in HIV, an expert in haematology, and an expert in hepatology, and perhaps some counselling or something else as well. But because of the way HIV came into our community, it sort of stayed. We were sort of ostracised from the rest of the HIV community to a certain extent. It became the function of our haemophilia doctors to become our HIV experts, and that should never have been their role. I'm sure most of them tried reasonably hard to do a good job, but they could never be really good at looking after HIV because it was an evolving field, things were changing all the time, and do their job as a haemophilia consultant. So in hindsight, not for me, because I was really lucky, I got to 97 without dying and without being too dramatically ill, even though it was pretty tough. But the kids who died in the end of 96, for example, I'm reasonably confident if they'd gone to an HIV specialist, they might have got different treatments quicker, access to trials, all sorts of things like that, which weren't available. But I'd like to say that my haemophilia team at that time at the adult hospital, which was Dr. Wild and his nurses, were absolutely excellent. And for me at that time, having what I call a one-stop shop was really, really great, because any problem I had, I phoned them up and they'd try and deal with it. And okay, it probably wasn't the best example of shared care, but for me it worked. But for other people, I think it probably didn't work, and that might have been at their cost. But yeah, my haemophilia team on the unit were always really supportive and really good.
In terms of hepatitis,
Yep.
you are hepatitis B positive and hepatitis C positive.
That's right.
In terms of the hepatitis C, when did you become aware that you had hepatitis C?
Again, it's this drip effect and learning things in a piecemeal fashion. So I knew I had hepatitis definitely when I was a teenager, but it was never talked about. I was never sort of sat down and told I had hepatitis. Like I said before, my mum was she wouldn't say, I want you to clean up blood spillages because you got hepatitis. It was just, you must clean up all your blood spillages. When I went to the QE, which was for the adults in Birmingham, I think it was at the start of 94. And I just remember it being mentioned. Dr. Wild would talk about it, about hepatitis. But I didn't know I didn't really know there was A, B, and C. I just knew I had hepatitis. But it started to become apparent to me that I had hepatitis C, and then eventually I realised I did have hepatitis B as well. But it wasn't like a huge blow or anything, because I was going to die from HIV. I could have all the viruses in the world, it didn't really matter, because I was going to die anyway. So chuck another one in, it doesn't really matter.
you've got many hundreds of pages of medical records, and we've been through them. Is there any record in them of a diagnosis with hepatitis C?
There was, so the only way we can relate hepatitis C in my records would have been I presented with hepatitis-like symptoms in the mid-80s. I don't know which year without looking at my records. My mother took me up to see Dr. Hill and said he's presenting. She said she was given reasonably short thrift, which was a common theme, but after a while she was told that I had non-A, non-B. Now, at that time, it seems ridiculous now, but at that time, my mother thought the non-A, non-B meant not hepatitis, and it was some other kind of problem, but she never really understood what it was or what was causing me to present with those problems, and we just plodded on through, really. But obviously, looking back, non-A, non-B was probably hepatitis C.
But there's nothing in your records after there's a formal hepatitis C test to indicate that you were tested and that test was communicated to you.
What, for hep C?
For hepatitis C.
No, I mean, no, it's just...
There's just a blank in your records as far as that's concerned.
Yeah, I really didn't know about hepatitis C. I know it sounds ridiculous, but I really didn't know until I was probably at the adult hospital, and it became apparent that I had these hepatitis viruses. But like I say, it wasn't a blow. It was just the way it was.
And your recollection that you weren't told is supported by your medical records because there's simply nothing in them which suggests anything else.
Yeah.
You went on treatment for hepatitis C in 2010 and 2011 with interferon and ribavirin. Can you tell us something of the effect of that treatment on you?
Yeah, so first of all, leading up to that HCV treatment, we'd been trying to have a family, or we were in the midst of having a family. So to start my HCV treatment, I had to change my HIV treatment, which wasn't compliant, or which caused an interaction with the HCV treatment. So that was one thing. But I couldn't change my HIV treatment because we were at the Chelsea and Westminster trying to have a baby. And if you change your HIV treatment, it means you can't try and have IVF treatment, because when you change your HIV treatment, you can have a dip in your viral load can be detectable potentially. So we had all these things to juggle, and we had a child as well already. Eventually, we managed to align things. I changed my HIV treatment, and I started hepatitis C treatment. At the time, my hep C was relatively stable. I'd had subcutaneous biopsies some years before, and I'd had fibroscans. My fibroscans up to that point were around about 9.5. So that's like a moderate fibrosis. So not ideal, but not critical either. We were always told that there was new treatments coming along, and I'd delayed having hep C treatment for quite a long time up to that point. And also we were being told that the longer you leave it, the more damage your liver gets, the less likely it is that hep C treatment will work. So just simple things at that age, like just going for a drink or something, racks you with guilt because you think you're just compounding the problem on your liver. And also, I mean, I know health's important, but also you want to have a normal life as well. You want to go and have a drink sometimes with a friend or those kind of things.
So
anyway,
eventually you started the treatment.
so I started the treatment. I can remember it vividly. I started in April 2010. Because of my genotype, I had a 48-week program of interferon ribavirin, and I was told it would be like having flu for a year, which it was. It was pretty miserable. It was like having flu, but just worse than normal flu. I felt so sick. I was on antiemetics all the time. It felt like it sucked the soul out of my body. I couldn't eat. I couldn't eat with the family. I couldn't even walk down. I couldn't walk from here to the other side of this room. It was just debilitating. It was horrific. But part of, like I said earlier, about becoming adherent and compliant to medication, I saw this opportunity as a chance to get rid of my HCV, which would be good in the long term. So I stuck at my treatment, and even though it was dreadful, I kept on going. And then I was really low a lot of the time, low mood swings, that kind of thing. And then after 46 weeks, I went into a really bad chemical depression, and I would be I can remember now, right at the very end, just being lay on the floor in the fetal position, just crying and just being... It was so hard, harder than anything else. It just took everything away from me. And up until that point, it was my mental and emotional fortitude that had got me through the physical problems in my life, my HIV, and I could defeat those physical things. And then this very last hurdle, which was going to try and clear my hepatitis C, it took my mental strength away. It's an horrendous treatment. Now, I don't want to go into saying, they wouldn't give it to... They shouldn't give it to the worst people in the world or anything like that, but it was just horrific. It had a huge impact on our family. And it's had a terrible impact on me. And they took me off it after 46 weeks. And they said to me, after 6 weeks, you'll feel much better. And 6 weeks turned into 6 months. 6 months turned into 6 years. And I've never been the same person again. It's taken a huge part of me away of what I was. And it's only just recently, 8 years later, for the first 6 years or so, I would have swapped. I would have had the hepatitis C back and not taken the treatment. It's had a terrible effect on us.
You've also said in your statement that you feel that you have some survivor guilt because so few within the co-infected community are still alive, and you feel you have something similar to PTSD.
Yeah. And I think those feelings are exacerbated. My emotional frailty since having my Hep C treatment. I was resilient until then, but that emotional frailty highlights these things, and I've thought about these things for a long time. So when I was doing a lot of research at the university, I used to speak to the social worker at Birmingham, who was really good. And I used to say that these feelings you get, and not just me, other people in my community, in the co-infected community, they're getting this sort of... and I don't want to belittle anyone who's got PTSD. I don't know what else to call it apart from PTSD, because when I've read research articles or heard people talking about their experience of PTSD, it just resonates with what I felt and what I know other people in my community have felt. And so my social worker said he wanted to do some research into that and see whether that was a factor in our community. Unfortunately, he never did. But I know myself that it might not be PTSD, but it's something similar to that, and I feel it a lot. And I also have this survivor guilt. Guilt isn't perhaps the right word, but I sit there, and especially in the weeks leading up to this day, I've thought about some of the boys who died, who I was in hospital with, that they had the same treatment as me, they were the same age as me, some of them almost to the day, and they died and I didn't. I'd see them, they'd be on the ward with me because we would spend so much of our life on the ward, and then you'd see them start to deteriorate and they'd be gone. They'd be taken off to the isolation ward, you'd never see them again. And we didn't know where they went. They went to this mythical place. I don't mean heaven, I mean an isolation ward. And when you went to that isolation ward, you never came back. And so, yeah, I don't know why I'm sat here today giving evidence and some of those boys aren't. And it could have been quite easily them giving similar evidence to what I'm giving today and me, who died in the early 90s.
And you've described that has informed who you are from a very young age and has moulded your whole person, and that you're tired now. Absolutely.
It's an irrevocable situation. You can't change what's happened, and I'm up until I took the HCV treatment, I'd have said, I'm proud of that. I'll take it on the chin, I'll battle this, and I'll get on with it, and I'll defeat it, and I'll do my best to do that. But now, yeah, it gets really tiring, and you can't escape it. And people say things like, "Oh, the treatments are better, and this is better, and you got a better life expectancy, and all this kind of stuff." And it's rubbish, because we've been damaged. You can't reverse that. You can't have that kind of psychology in your head about dying, about accepting your own death at that age, and then suddenly go, "Oh yeah, everything's fine, we'll just crack on as normal," because it doesn't work like that. Well, it doesn't for me anyway. And whilst you try to have a normal life, it's insipid. It sort of gets into every detail of life. You can't sort of escape what happened to us, and it affects every major decision you make in life. It affects everything. It affects the psychology of who you are. You become who you are, and I'm proud of that. But that's informed by HIV, HCV, and haemophilia, because it's inevitable that going through those experiences moulds the person you are.
Throughout your teenage years, your early adulthood, were you ever offered any counselling or psychological support?
No. The only... So when I was in my 20s, I'm sure I could have phoned in my haemophilia department and said, "Look, I'm in a really bad way, get me some counselling." They probably would have done. But I was resilient then, and I just got on with it. But in the early days, I mean, it was complete anathema. There was never any... We weren't even told, let alone offered counselling. You can't be given counselling for something you don't know about. I was offered counselling So when the structure changed for EIBSS and we had to be re-evaluated to see whether we deserved to have any kind of support, I had to go to my haemophilia unit and be asked some questions about my life and my situation. The first question I was asked by my now haemophilia team, which are great, was, has HCV ever affected, has your treatment ever affected you? And at that point, I'd never been asked that before. Nobody had ever asked me. I finished the treatment, I was discharged from the hepatology unit, off you go and get on with it. And 6 years later, someone asks, has it ever affected you? And it was just, it all came flooding out, and it ended up being quite cathartic. But it was the first time I'd been asked, and I sort of broke down, and I said yes, and it helped me realise that I'd been quite damaged by the Hep C treatment. And then as a result of that meeting, that interview, they said I could access mental health services or counselling, but obviously in our area there's an 18-month wait list, so I've gone on with it myself.
And you've ended up seeking it privately?
No, just get on with it myself.
Just yourself?
Absolutely, yeah. Nobody can help me. At the moment, I'm quite happy with my family and my friends to sort of battle through, and I can come to my own resolutions at the moment. I'm not saying that that's always going to be the case.
You've also discovered there was a risk that you've contracted VTJD, but you've never been told whether or not you received an implicated batch. What's been the impact of that on you emotionally?
So there's the theoretical risk of receiving treatment, obviously from patients who later went on to die from CJD. I'm reasonably fortunate in that it doesn't seem I've had a directly affected batch. Again, it's just another thing to try to computate and put into some kind of reasoning in your head. I think most of our community are too preoccupied with trying to deal with the now and working out, sort of navigating our way through the current situation, that we haven't really, well, we don't know what to expect either, but we haven't really sort of started to worry too much about CJD. And fingers crossed it won't come back to bite us.
In terms of your family life, as you said, you went through a number of rounds of IVF. You now do have 3 children.
That's
but
right.
The process was, I think you called it pretty brutal for both you and your partner.
That's right, yeah.
And you had to fund that entirely privately.
Not entirely, but majority
Majority.
privately, yeah.
And it's taken all your life savings.
At that time, yeah. Well, it wasn't life savings. My father died, left us some money, and we used that money to facilitate going to the Chelsea and Westminster to pay for IVF, for sperm washing programmes.
And you said in your statement you feel very strongly that you shouldn't have had to do that. You shouldn't have had to fund the IVF
Absolutely.
yourselves.
At that time, now, the given medical evidence is that it's accepted that if you're a serodiscordant couple and the positive person is undetectable, then it's safe enough and accepted by the medical fraternity that it's okay to try for a child naturally. Even though we knew back then that some people had children and hadn't passed HIV on, the evidence wasn't there for us to make that decision. It was a really difficult decision for me and my partner. So we decided to undergo IVF, and we had numerous rounds. We had a round of IUI. We think we lost count, but we think it was 4 rounds of IVF, fresh cycles. And obviously from each round, you can freeze embryos as well and then go back. So there's 4 rounds of fresh cycles interspersed in between with frozen cycles. Does that make sense? The problem being was our first cycle, when we were at the Chelsea and Westminster, we managed to create a lot of viable embryos, but because the Chelsea and Westminster didn't have a storage facility, or freezer, whatever you want to call it, for a co-infected patient, we had to destroy those. So we had an implant from the first cycle, a fresh cycle. All the other viable embryos got chucked away, and then we had to start again with the next fresh cycle next time we went. But if there'd been a storage facility for our embryos, we could have frozen them and gone back, rather than having my partner having to endure all the injections, all the hormone treatment, all the procedures, the invasive procedures, all the things that come with that kind of cycle. It was pretty heavy going. It was emotionally hard, I think, and physically hard for my partner. And okay, we're very lucky to have children, and anything is worth that. But it always felt like a bit of a, after everything, it felt like a bit of a, like a poke with a sharp stick. After we had to go there off our own backs and pay for everything. We spent nearly £20,000 trying to go through this, and we felt like we were making responsible decisions that should have been supported, really, not us having to make responsible decisions and then pay for it as well.
Because in your statement, you make the point that if your partner or your children had been infected, then the NHS would have had to pay for the treatment and the care of them then. Yeah,
if you choose to look at it in that way, then it would be much more expensive for the NHS to fund a lifetime of HIV drugs rather than a cycle of IVF.
In terms of your education and career, you've spoken of going to university, but initially you hadn't worked particularly hard for your A-levels because you didn't really see the point of it at that stage. But then life became more stable, and in 1998, as you say, you went off to university. Yeah. After you completed your degree, you went on to do your master's and then started your PhD.
That's right.
What was the PhD in?
Okay, so first of all, just going back to my GCSEs, I didn't try for my GCSEs either, but I was able to just cruise through them. But you had to work a bit hard with A-levels. There was absolutely no incentive for me to work hard and revise and waste my time revising when I was going to die anyway in a couple of years. There's absolutely no point. So I didn't bother, and subsequently didn't get many A-levels. Then when I did do my postgraduate work, I was in a much better place. I was able to focus on it. A lot of my PhD work ended up looking at, well, I wanted to look at my community. My thesis for my master's was a piece of qualitative research on the effect of HIV and Hep C co-infection on my community, which was okay. It's nothing groundbreaking, but it was okay. It was an interesting, for me, perhaps more than the people involved. I then, with my PhD, I chose to look more deeply at certain points at that. So I looked at the psychosocial impact on my community. I looked at a concept called iatrogenesis, which is a theory postulated by Ivan Illich in the 60s and 70s, which basically talks about doctor-assisted harm. on patients. Funnily enough, there's not a huge amount of in-depth work on that. And I also wanted to look at this notion of the expert patient and sort of tie all those together in regards to our community. Because our community do have a lot of knowledge which they're not always given credit for because of their experiences and what they've been through.
Unfortunately, you weren't able to complete the PhD.
No,
Why was that?
there's a number of factors. A couple of dominant ones were my laptop was stolen out of my car and my backup memory stick got corrupted, so I lost most of my first year's work, which was pretty soul-destroying. Also, the department I was in was supportive. I felt a PhD was a conduit for me to be able to do. It was sort of labelled as this is your opportunity to do your own piece of research, that you'll never have this opportunity again to spend 3 years looking at something that you want to look at. But inevitably, it got hijacked by the department. They said, oh, well, why didn't you start looking at this or looking at that? Because they had parameters which they wanted me to explore. Right. So a PhD thesis probably wasn't exactly the right thing for what I wanted. I should have done my own research off my own back rather than doing it via a PhD. But also, there was my health, there was starting a family, there was a number of things, but I never really recovered after having my laptop stolen, no.
And your health concerns carried on after not completing the PhD into your career, and you found it very difficult, you say in your statement, to have a career because your health is quite precarious.
Yeah, but I think anyone in our community, their health is generally precarious, and they can be worse at sometimes more than others. After I left the university department and we started a family, I then temporarily started a job, which was only just a bit of a stopgap, but it was working shifts, nothing to do with it was just in security, it was nothing to do with what I'd studied for, but the shift was so hard and punishing, I was getting ill. All the time I was off work, I had sort of chest problems, breathing problems, and it was just the stress and the exhaustion. I physically couldn't cope with having a young child in the house and trying to work shifts and all my health problems combined. I went to resign from my job in 2009. The then manager, who was quite supportive, I disclosed my health problems, which I didn't need to, but I felt it appropriate considering what I was going through. And she offered me, again, a temporary stopgap, but for me to stay there, to go on a 0 hours contract. They get a lot of bad press, but actually it's suited our family really well. So I'm able to work, because I still need to work up until the recent structural changes in the payments. I had to work. There was no other option. And so being able to work flexibly around my health was really important.
You've also described that you didn't ever aspire to be in the rat race because of the psychological impact of all your experiences
Absolutely.
growing up.
Yeah. I don't know whether it's the same for other people in my community or other people who've gone through hard times. You look at the structures in society and you look at the way people run around and you look at the emphasis on material nonsense, on just everything, and you just think it's all pointless. There's much more important things in life, and sometimes we get our priorities skewed. And so it's always been important for me to, if that's what I believe, then I should try and live my life that way.
You just said a moment ago that financially you did need to work until there were the structural changes. In fact, financially things have been very difficult over the years, you said in your statement. And you were involved in the HIV litigation, or at least your parents were, on your behalf. And they recall signing a waiver. What have they told you about that?
So my mother has said that whilst they knew signing the waiver wasn't the right thing to do, they were told if they didn't do it, nobody would get any support. And if they didn't sign, you'd have to take on the American pharmaceuticals yourself and you'd have no chance. And so there was a real sort of pushed into a dead end, really. My mum and dad had no real financial capacity to fund any kind of separate individual litigation, and so we just joined everyone else, and because life expectancy was so short at that time, any kind of support was better than nothing. So, but clearly it was wrong, inappropriate, not fit for purpose under the circumstances.
You received initial payments from the McFarlane Trust as a young teenager, and so you received the sum for single people under 18.
Yep.
What's your view of that now?
Well, it's always stank a bit, really. I don't understand why. And it's not because I'm bitter. It's this concept of fairness, and you'll hear this throughout all sorts of things to do with the inflected blood inquiry. That there's things you'll find which always seem unfair, whether that's finances or whatever. But because I was under 18 at the time of that payment, I would have been about 15. I had the under 18 payment. Obviously, people older than 18 got twice as much, and people older than 18 with children got 3 times as much. And it's never really sat right. And so when I became 18, I wasn't eligible for the next upgrade. And when we had children, I wasn't eligible for the next upgrade. And that's life, get on with it, but it just sort of doesn't sit right, really.
You said, I wondered whether I was inconsequential due to my age and thought it was unfair not to then receive the uplift later.
Absolutely. But then this feeling of being inconsequential and chucked on the scrap heap is repeated with various things, whether that's access to recombinant and all those other things that happen. You just become sort of used to being battered by it all, really, and it just become. Now we're in this situation, it seems incredulous, but at the time you don't have any choice but to get on with life, really. It's just the way things are. So, but it was completely unfair, yeah.
You didn't realise until you were in your 20s that there were further grants you could apply for. But when you did apply for them, you felt that the money provided was a pittance, but also you objected to the requirement to have to provide quotes. Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit more about how the system made you feel?
In relation to McFarlane Trust? So McFarlane Trust was set up in a rush. It wasn't fit for, structurally, it wasn't fit for purpose from the outset. It was funded badly, and it was just like a bit of a perfect storm, really. While there was people trying their best at certain points in the Trust's history, it was never fit for purpose. It was never going to facilitate what our community needed, really, and give the support that our community deserved to get as well.
Before we talk about your role as a trustee at one stage, I just want to pick up with you the point about having to give quotes before you could obtain a grant.
So the quote system put people off a lot of the time. But it wasn't just even the quote system. Some co-infected haemophiliacs didn't even know the trust existed until a few years ago, and so they never got, and people were in absolute dire need, and they never got any support. So you did need to provide quotes. Now, if you knew how to play the game, you could get quotes out of thin air, literally. But people who weren't as savvy about how the trusts was organised and ran were sort of put off by that system, and they didn't want to trigger. It was tiresome to get people, if you wanted a bit of work done on the house, to get 3 people to come round and quote for it. It's really a pain, really. And
You've described it as being totally disempowering.
absolutely, yeah. Because the people the trust was there to care for were some of the most vulnerable people, really. They're going through terrible things, and to have to justify and get quotes for those kinds of things, it just wasn't appropriate at all. And whilst the trust did some good things in some ways, a lot of things were really bad.
You were a trustee of the Macfarlane Trust in 2002, 2003.
But I started around then.
Started then
I was a
until...
trustee for about 2 or 3 years, yeah.
What was your experience of being a trustee?
So when I joined, I applied. A position came up for the trust. I'd been getting a bit more immersed myself in HIV in my community. There wasn't loads of people going for that position. I decided to give it a go, and so when I started, I had very little knowledge of the trust. The trust, like I said a minute ago, the trust wasn't fit for purpose from the outset. So I don't want to sit here and demonise individuals, because I worked, at the time I was there especially, I worked with some, what I feel is some good people, trying to do their best, and in some cases making a difference for people. But because of the limitations of what they were working with, they were never going to be able to help people. And when people are in dire need, that's when the clash becomes. So it became apparent over time that the trust wasn't resourced by the government, funded by the government properly. And then there's an imbalance because of the nature of the trust and how it was incepted, that I always remember people saying they weren't a lobbying group, the trustees. They shouldn't be lobbying the government for more money. It wasn't particularly their role. And there was always concern that if they struck up too much of a fuss, that potentially funding could be withdrawn. Now, in hindsight, that probably shouldn't have been the case, and perhaps voices should have been louder. But at that time, I can understand that that's how... I think they felt that they were just carrying out the duties as requested by the government. So all these problems, again, stemmed from the government because the trust was not fit for purpose from the start.
What led you to leave and stop being a trustee?
Again, it was that time in my life before we had a family, and my health was again precarious at times, and I just think I felt in any voluntary role you do, it's got to be like a two-way thing, and I've done lots of voluntary work in my life. You need to believe in it, and you need to get something out of it as a volunteer, as much as what you're trying to help. And I'm not just talking about the MFT here, in any voluntary capacity. And I felt I'd had my time there, and it was time to move on, really. There wasn't any significant problem or issue going on that suddenly rised up and caused me to leave. But it was, again, not fit for purpose.
You described earlier that there had been a change in the environment and feel of the place, though.
Yeah, so that sort of happened at the time I was leaving. The chief executive changed around about that time, I think just literally as I left. And so that was another transition point, which felt like a good time to move as well. But I did notice, and I have noticed, that as the years passed after I left, the trust the way the trust operated seemed to change. It became more bureaucratic, it became less sensitive, although some might argue it was those things to start with anyway. And it just became an even worse beast, really. It morphed into something which was unhelpful. Eventually I just distanced myself completely. I never applied for grants or anything ever again after a certain point, which I can't remember when it was, but it was just pointless.
And your feeling is that EIBSS has a better approach so far. Why is that?
I've not ever applied to it. I can't say how structurally they work or how they are to approach, because I've never approached them. But what I can say is, over the last 18 months or whatever it is, since our payment structure changed to something that's more in line to trying to help us live on a daily basis, it's taken a huge weight off our shoulders. If I'm ill now and I don't go to work, we can live, we can exist, we can get by, whereas before that just wasn't the case. So having that financial change in the uplift in payments we received has been a huge benefit to us, because things were so hard before. Doesn't mean things can't be better, doesn't mean things should be better, but this initial uplift made a huge difference to our family, and that's when I talk about things being better, that's what I'm relating to.
Stu, those are the questions I have for you. I'm just going to turn to Mr. Snowden, who, as you know, represents you. Mr. Snowden just wants me to take you to a document. Before we go there, we were discussing earlier that there was nothing in your medical records that indicate a diagnosis of hepatitis C, no virology test or a record of a specific consultation. There is a letter from 2001. Henry, it's 1252007. It's a letter from 2001. It's the only thing that they have found where there is simply bluntly put in the middle of it, diagnosis, HIV and HCV infection in 2001. So he just wanted to flag that up from 2001.
Yeah. So that would tie in to 2026. Yeah. I probably would have been aware slightly before that I had Hep C, but not a huge amount of years before.
Is there anything further you would like to say?
I've got some final comments, if that's all right. I know some of the other members of my community have said about accountability being a trickle-down thing from the government, from the pharmaceuticals, from the commissioning groups, from the hospitals, from the doctors, and like other people have iterated, I'm sure Sir Brian and his team will be looking at those things and how it all contributed to this problem for myself and my community. I'm very aware of evidence sounding like excessive hyperbole, and I've been really cautious about how I choose my words, because I want to make sure that it's frank, but you understand when things are a problem, that when I'm saying things which sound hyperbolic, it's because it has been a problem. So I've tried very carefully to word this, but it's important for me to put across in this last bit how some of these things have affected me. So firstly, I cannot thank you enough, all of you here, involved and behind the scenes, for giving me the opportunity to share my evidence with you and basically what is my story. Most importantly, I thank you for listening, for giving us and my community the time, space and the credibility to be heard and the respect. And it's unbelievable after all these years that you're listening to us. The last 35 years now seem quite surreal, that we were just drifting along with this burden upon us and with nobody knowing, caring or really understanding the true depths of what really happened to us. Even in times of clarity and wellness, there's been an ineluctable sense of pain and emptiness which has compounded every single year. And things simply don't get easier, it gets harder. People think an absence of quantifiable pain, improvements in medication, and more positive longer-term prognosis automatically equates to a happier and stable situation. But that's far from the truth. You can't just deflect the damage that was done to us. Even after 35 years, there's very, very few people who know my story, and the burden of stigma still weighs heavily, and you remain in a cycle of shame, silence and oppression. And today, after all these years, giving evidence is my emancipation. Today is my coming out, and I shouldn't be scared. My community should not feel downtrodden, and these shackles shall be gone, to be replaced by pride in ourselves and the notion that my community has earned the right to be listened to and dealt with compassionately and with empathy. So, for those in my community who cannot be here, I also want my voice to be heard for you, boys I knew from hospital and grew up with there, boys such as Brett, David, Nikki, Ian, and many others. Your lives were ended far too early. I was just lucky perhaps, but I've not forgotten you. And I don't know why it's me sat here giving this evidence when it could have been you. I want people to understand our sufferance from those early days. What happened to us was wrong, and we have all paid a very heavy price, both those still alive and those who have died. Our lives have all been indelibly scarred by what has happened. Most importantly, I want to speak to my family and friends. To this point, only my partner, my mother, my sister, my stepfather and my stepmother know my history. I have always valued your support. To the rest of my family, I'm sorry we have not discussed this before. I hope it will not change your thoughts of us, but there are reasons why this has not been spoken about. I am sure you will continue to love us like you've always done, and that when I am gone, you will look after my family as they deserve. To my friends and neighbours who might come across this evidence, likewise, I hope you will be understanding and supportive of my family and children. And this is my truth to share with you. This has been my whole life, even though I try not to let it consume me. This has identified me and has become me for as long as I can remember, even though I've tried hard to live independently of it all. It affects almost every facet and decision in life. There are no winners, no happy ending to this morally impoverished situation. What has happened cannot be changed. The damage done to my community is irreversible. There are depths of pain you can scarcely imagine until you actually get there. It's often taken my physical health, and more recently, it's taken my emotional and mental fortitude. It's left me a shell of a human being at times, and I have often felt broken, and I'm just tired. However, even though giving evidence has been incredibly hard, I'm hoping this will be a cathartic process for me and start to give me an element of peace. I have great faith in Sir Brian and his team to reach conclusions that give us an element of closure so that we can take a big step in moving on in our lives and start to repair some of the damage. And I thank you for listening.
There's one question that I want to ask you. You mentioned a couple of times the structural problems of the Macfarlane Trust. Can you give any detail as to what you think was wrong with the structure?
So when the trust was incepted, it should have been structured in a much different way. It was a charity funded by the government, which is something of an anomaly with charitable status. The way the people involved perhaps should have been more government-led. It was poorly resourced. Everything just seemed to be done in a rush, and it could have been done much better. I'm not sure I have the answers to how it could have been structurally different, but what I'm confident in is that it wasn't ideal in the way it was incepted.
Thank you very much. You have given us a frank account, indeed careful with your words, but I think you yourself used the words how incredibly difficult it was to give evidence. And I hope that those who aren't those in the know already, when you came to give evidence, your mother, sister, stepfather, stepmother and partner, that others who know you and who become aware of what you have said, that they understand and respect you all the more for what has plainly been at times difficult for you. You've managed it remarkably well, if I may say so, and thank you very much for having the courage to come out.
Thank you very much.
We'll have a break of just a shade beyond 5 minutes to 20 to 5. 20 to 5.